Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back. I hope that you are having a good week and that you're doing well. I know that some of you have had some issues with power and that there have been some challenges related to weather. So that's difficult to hear, and I'm sorry about that. But if you're here tonight, or this afternoon, rather, it's so good to see you and welcome back. As you know, we're dealing with the issue of sociological voting. And really, what that has to do with is partisanship and the role of partisanship in explaining or determining the behavior of the voter when they go to the polls on election day. And this is really a question about the influence of the past and the role of past influences and whether we are a product of where we came from or we recreate ourselves as we go along. And this is a much, much bigger question than just partisanship and voting, because to say that partisanship is a product of our upbringing and the influence of our parents is to say that we are a product of our upbringing. The question then is, can we free ourselves from our upbringing, or are we ultimately determined by those past influences? And as we go through this discussion today, I want you to consider this question and think about what's at stake, because really the partisanship model of voter behavior is relatively rigid for precisely this reason. Partisanship doesn't change that much. And so to say that it's a product of past influences is to say that we may be shaped by those influences in ways that are irreversible. So I want you to consider that question as we go along. Thank you again for being here. And actually, let me consider a comment from a student who says, this question is very circumstantial, but personally, I like to believe that we use our past influences to build who we are, despite the connotation of those experiences. We are products of where we came from, but we do not have to become statistics. So it may be more nuanced than to say that we are just simply a product of where we came from. And this is a really interesting comment from Brittany, and I'd like to consider that as well as we move along and think about the various ways that the past influences our behavior as voters through partisanship. And so we'll return, for starters, to the funnel of causality, which I presented to you last time. This is the infamous funnel of causality. And at the very center is party attachment and partisanship or party ID, the key determining factor for the vote. But before party attachment, there is, of course, group and family loyalty and family experiences. Now, the Michigan scholars are those who promoted the sociological model of voting the most, say that partisanship is developed relatively early on because your formative years and your formative experiences at home or with your family really take place early on. And so it's then that you sort of cement and refine your partisanship in your value orientations, in your psychological attachment to a particular party. And they insist, moreover, that the partisanship of an individual is relatively inertial and self-perpetuating. And so once it's set in motion in childhood or early on, you're sort of on a path that can be difficult to break, with some exceptions that we'll discuss later. And we're kind of recycling a little bit of the content from Monday, but I want to set the scene as we continue to discuss this. Remember that the key idea here is that the groups you belong to impact your views. And so first and foremost, that is your family, but also maybe what you do in the community or where you go, if you go to church or you belong to other organizations, maybe those in your neighborhood. The idea is that this demography is going to be your destiny. And so it's that idea that maybe your zip code really does determine your behavior and really your prosperity, perhaps. There's a whole set of questions about your upbringing and your sort of emergence and how it can impact your success or your behavior later in life. And so this is a general discussion that taps into a lot of debates about the role of upbringing in the role initial formative experiences. Of course, one of the challenges is that people belong to a variety of different groups. And so, if you have a lot of different belongings. So maybe you go to church, but you're also a member of a trade union, but you're also a member of a very religious family. But in addition, you are a farmer. You could imagine a whole number of characteristics and social characteristics that might be cross cutting or that might create a very nuanced political attachment. The way that the Michigan scholars reconcile this set of complications is they say that how much you identify with a particular group is what matters the most. And so at this stage, they distinguish between direction and strength. And these are two dimensions of partisanship that come into play in analyses of partisanship in this debate, in this literature. Before we continue, I'm going to check the chat. Christopher says, adulthood is where current life experience clashes with upbringing upon reflection. So there is definitely room for transformation about identity and politics. Anthony says, but some people also stick with their views throughout adulthood as well. They decide to stay with what they know and believe. At least that's my opinion, how I've seen it. So already we see that it's both possible for values and orientations to stick, uh, as well as evolve considerably over the life of an individual. And this this taps into some interesting debates and questions in this literature. How rigid or inflexible is partisanship, and does it change in response to circumstances, or is it developed early on, and does it persist, despite any number of changes in the environment of a person in the course of their life? We'll address that here in a moment. The first component of partisanship for the sociological theory is simply what's referred to as direction. And this is basically just the categorical association of a person's partisanship. Are you a Democrat or a Republican? Are you a socialist or a liberal or a conservative or a communist? As you can see, it depends on the system, right? So, if in the particular political system there's a conservative party and a liberal party, the relevant IDs might be conservative and liberal, or independent as well. If the relevant IDs are socialist, liberal, conservative, communist, national party, those would be the relevant IDs. The idea is that your partisanship will align or cohere with the major parties in that system. And so already it's going to differ radically based on the system. So for example, in the United States, there is no viable socialist party. And so it doesn't really have any significance or meaning to say that, I'm a socialist by party ID in the United States, because socialists don't win seats and they don't have any power in government. And so in terms of meaningful political participation, we often distinguish between really two parties, and that's the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. And that's a very narrow and limiting set of labels, admittedly, but you can see already that the system itself is going to be peculiar and have its own characteristics. If we were in Colombia, the relevant labels would be the conservatives and the liberals. If we were in Chile, the labels might be the Christian Democrats, the communists, the socialists, the renewalists, the renovationists, and so on and so forth. So you can see then that it varies by system, and it's going to vary based on really not just the system, but maybe the type of party system and the number of viable parties in government, and so on and so forth. But the second component is strength, and that relates to the intensity of a person's psychological attachment. So to what degree they associate with or attach themselves psychologically to the party. I want you to notice something, that party ID is defined explicitly in terms of a psychological attachment, a state of mind, right? Not something else or something more material, but something more psychological that's in our head that relates to an attraction or a revulsion, a state of mind, a desire, an affiliation, as opposed to something else. And so this is a peculiar and a different way of defining partisanship than, say, the economic voting literature does, where choices are viewed much more in terms of a calculation of costs and benefits based on conditions in the real world. And so you might think about, for instance, the relationship between strength of party attachment and the likelihood of voting for an opposing party's candidate. If you are minimally attached to a party and perhaps not at all attached, but maybe registered with that party, you might be likely to vote for an opposing party's candidate. This is hypothetical, by the way. I just actually pulled a vector from the internet, but I just am giving you a sense of what kinds of relationships might be of interest for someone in this literature and someone, working from this perspective. On the other hand, if you're highly attached to a political party, you're much, much less likely, and perhaps not at all likely, to vote for an opposing party's candidate. And so it becomes quite important, not just the direction of your partisanship, but the intensity, the degree of your partisanship, understood as being something that is psychological and in your head, a state of mind. Checking on the chat here, there's some activity. In response to Anthony's comment that some people stick with their views, Christopher says, well, it depends where you go in life. You might take a different route. Gustavo says taking a different way is easier said than done, especially if you live in an environment where everyone has a similar train of thought. So I see that many of you are really thinking in these terms, thinking about the social influences that might bear on you and that might make it difficult to adopt a different partisanship, right, or change partisanship. That's the nature of a sociological analysis, identifying some of those constraints. And even those of you who seem to be acknowledging or arguing that you can take a different route are still acknowledging that it takes courage and drive, which might be a concession that it might be unusual, frankly, for people to break out of that social circle or break out of that environment. And this is precisely what the Michigan scholars are talking about when they say the sort of influence and the role of formative influences in shaping partisanship, and the way that partisanship in turn will influence voting behavior. And so sociological voting theories really have in common three main arguments, and we've kind of cohered around these as we've gone along. But let's go ahead and be straightforward and identify them one by one. First and foremost, there's the argument that people identify psychologically with political groups just as they do with religious, class, racial, and ethnic groups. And so think about that for a moment. That is to say that your association with the Democratic Party is just as powerful for you as your association with whatever race or class or religious group or ethnic group to which you belong. That is to say that your association with the Republican Party is just as powerful as your association with whatever religious or class or racial or ethnic group to which you belong. It's a very powerful and profound statement to say that one's partisanship weighs just as heavily on them as any of those other identity groups or affiliations might. And this is an important starting point, because if everything rides on partisanship, partisanship has to be a very, very compelling and powerful component of politics and of this individual or this person's identity. And here in a moment, we'll kind of step back and consider whether and how this might apply to us individually. And we can put this sort of to the test, so to speak. The second set of arguments is the following. Identification with the political party is a long-term component of politics. So identification should persist even when people vote for a candidate representing the opposing party. So it's like when people say, oh, I'm a lifelong Republican, but in this election, I had to vote for Joe Biden. I didn't leave the Republican Party, but in this election, I had to vote for Joe Biden, for example. Or, I'm a lifelong Democrat, but in this election, I had to vote for Donald Trump, and so on and so forth, saying I didn't necessarily leave the Democratic Party, but I voted for the opposing party's candidate. And this captures it neatly, the idea that partisan ID is so embedded and so rigid and so unflinching that even when individuals vote for someone else, they'll actually announce their continued loyalty to their party, despite the move to vote for the opposing candidate temporarily. It's as if to say that it's the partisanship that is still the most important element of the entire equation. It's just an exceptional moment that they would be voting for the candidate of the opposing party. And many of us in the chat are noticing that this is the kind of thing that maybe we've heard from people around us in our life. And in this example of party ID persisting even when people vote for a candidate representing the opposing party, that's a really understandable example, one that many of us have experienced. And really you can think of another example of identification persisting, and that would be where people vote for a candidate who's viewed as anathema to their group precisely because their partisanship would dictate that they would vote for that candidate. And so in this case, identification persists even when a candidate is perceived to be detrimental to another social group to which that person belongs. And I'll actually give you an example of that here in a moment. But the third set of arguments that comes from the sociological voting literature and theory is perhaps the weightiest of all. And this is that party identification will affect not just vote choice, but also a whole set of behaviors and attitudes associated with the vote. And that includes evaluations of the major party candidates, of the issues, and of the parties themselves. And so in this way, sociological voting, the people who argue that sociological voting best explains voting are saying that when people evaluate candidates, they're not evaluating them based on economic considerations. They're not engaging in a calculation of costs and benefits in forecasting or punishing or rewarding. Instead, they're evaluating candidates based upon their pre-existing party identification. And so in this way, the proponents of sociological voting try to rule out the role for economic voting that is a rival explanation of voting behavior. And this is a way that we begin to address the disagreements between these schools of thought and how we can critique them from each other's perspective. Now, I want to lighten things up a little bit, and we need some comic relief. And so what we'll do is we'll watch a video of Jimmy Kimmel, and this is pretty funny. This is from October, and I won't give much of a preamble, but basically what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at some attitudes and responses of people interviewed on the street. And then we're going to try to use theories of sociological voting to explain or understand or shed light on those attitudes. So kick back for a moment and we'll reconvene here in a second after we watch this video.
On Saturday, Fatty Lapone gave another Evita-style performance from his balcony. He spoke to a group of mostly Black and Latino supporters who assembled hilariously on the White House lawn. They're part of a group called Blexit, which is supposed to be a group of Black people who support Trump. The truth is, these are people who were paid to be at the event. They had their travel expenses covered in exchange for showing up, putting on the T-shirt. Trump spoke only for 18 minutes, but he did make sure to bring up his favorite thing to say whenever he sees a Black person.
The fact is that I've done more for the Black community than any president since Abraham Lincoln. I say it, nobody can dispute it. Nobody can dispute it.
Nobody can. Everyone can dispute it. John Wilkes Booth would dispute it. Okay. he does seem to believe that he's very popular with the black community. On the campaign trail in 2016, he said, at the end of the 4 years, I guarantee you I will get over 95% of the African American vote. I promise you. Well, we're at the end of those 4 years, and we wanted to put his guarantee to the test. So we sent a camera crew out on the Hollywood Boulevard to poll African American passersby to see if we can find anyone who will be supporting Trump at the ballot box next month.
Trump said that he was going to get 95% of the African American vote. As a black man, are you voting for Trump?
I absolutely am not.
Absolutely, I would not.
Hell no.
No.
Probably not. I can't vote for a racist.
Hell no.
Nah. No, I'm not.
Am I voting for Trump?
Yeah.
Nah.
No, I'm not.
Hell no.
No, not at all.
Hell no.
No.
Absolutely not.
No, not voting for Trump.
Hell no.
No, I'm not voting for Trump.
Absolutely not.
Is that a baby?
Yeah, this is a baby.
And that baby with Trump, against Trump?
Against, definitely. Trump. I don't mess with Trump at all.
No.
No, I'm not voting for Trump.
No.
I ain't gonna vote for Trump.
No, I'm not voting for Trump.
Hell no, I ain't voting for that dude. Are you crazy?
No.
Hell no.
He's not getting my vote. No.
Absolutely not.
No, sir.
Do you know any black people who are voting for Trump?
I don't know any.
You don't know any?
Not one person.
Not one
that's
person?
black that said that.
No co-workers?
No co-workers.
You got uncles and aunties saying they're gonna vote for Trump?
No.
Mama voting for Trump?
No.
Daddy voting for Trump?
No.
Friends from church voting for Trump?
No, sir. I remember Trump in WWE. To me, that's what he's still doing. He's still on The Apprentice. He's still, this is a reality show. He's still acting a part.
Does anybody ever tell you that you sound like Obama?
Unfortunately, yes.
You can't pay me $1 million. I'm not voting for Trump.
Would you vote for Trump for $1 million?
No.
What about an Applebee's gift card?
No.
Free Wi-Fi?
Free Wi-Fi would be nice.
No Wi-Fi. Cellular data, brother.
I absolutely do not believe he's going to get 95% of the vote because I don't know a black man or a black woman that is going to vote for Donald Trump. And I am immersed in black people.
You ain't got a single black
Not a dog, not a black cat, not a black dog, not a black pit bull is going to vote for Donald Trump. I am Barack Obama and our proof is this.
All right. Maybe not 95. I am Jimmy Kimmel.
So all kidding aside, how would a sociological perspective on voting explain the low level of black support for Trump? What would you point to, or what would a sociological explanation look like?
I think a way to look at it would be using the second component or the second argument of sociological voting, because one sociological argument could be historically, Lyndon B. Johnson was the person who was a Democrat and put forth the Civil Rights Act in 1965, as well as Republicans being known for people like Barry Goldwater and George Wallace. So that could be the historical component that would lead to lower support among the black community for Trump.
So there's certainly some historical factors that might have set up a certain kind of party attachment, or is there an element of partisanship in here that helps us to understand this apparent low support? What is the sociological or sort of partisan component of the story? Does anyone want to take on that question? I think that, this is the US context, so we're sort of hopefully coming in with a little bit of background. I acknowledge that we don't have all the information in this lecture, but given what we know about US politics, what would the sort of partisan or sociological component be of this low support for Trump? Could it have to do with this? In terms of partisanship and party ID, Black Americans overwhelmingly lean Democratic, in perhaps more so than any other group. They are decisively and decidedly Democratic. Of course, there are Black Americans who are not, and you can see here that there is some proportion of the Republican base that is Black as well as Hispanic, but it's much more pronounced in the Democratic wing, where you find that Blacks actually make up a sizable share of the Democratic base. And in fact, as the headline of this Pew Research Center data from just recently says, non-whites make up 4 in 10 Democratic voters, but fewer than a fifth of Republican voters. And so a partisanship explanation of this low support for Trump would be that Blacks overwhelmingly favor the Democratic Party. Their partisan ID is the Democratic Party, and so they're going to vote for the Democratic candidate. This is the nature of a sociological explanation that would emphasize partisan ID and partisanship as the key component. Of course, the background and the context is equally important. And as Ishan points out, there's a historical context, and there's a lineage and a backdrop. There's a reason that the Blacks overwhelmingly support the Democratic Party. It has to do with the civil rights movement and their enfranchisement, their very participation in the system, and their very support for Democrats they largely owe to Democrats. And so that helps us to understand the context and the sort of formation of that partisanship. And what's noteworthy is that Black Americans, like any other group, belong to a variety of groups. And so Black Americans are often very religious as well. And religious Americans are often Republicans. But in this case, Black Americans are still overwhelmingly Democrats. And so you can see then that the sociological perspective does shed some light on this picture, because remember that they say that, the strength of your attachment or the strength of your association with a particular group will largely determine your partisanship and your behavior. And so obviously it's complicated and complex, and people are nuanced and complex, but the nature of a sociological analysis is to focus on the groups to which they belong in the nature of those groups and their attitudes and their partisanship. And so take a look here at the chat. Brittany says, according to the first sociological theory, African Americans tend to identify as liberal or democratic. Trump is the exact opposite of that. Yeah, and he's also from a different party. Critically, he's from a party to which Blacks have not traditionally gravitated and identified when it comes to their partisanship. Of course, there's also an interesting and important wrinkle here that shouldn't go unnoticed and undiscussed, and that is Latino support for Trump, because this is also a question that becomes relevant when we discuss the sociological theory of voting behavior in group attachment and partisanship. And so you see a sign like this, and it brings to mind some of the surprise from onlookers who didn't expect support for Trump from Latinos. And what I'd like to suggest to you is that we can understand this from the perspective of sociological voting relatively easily if we put together an account that would emphasize some of the formative influences in the partisan attachment that we consider important from the sociological perspective. So the question for you and the question for us as we wrestle with this and work through these questions is, how might a theory of sociological voting account for Latino support for Trump? How would that look? A sociological theory of voting that seeks to account for this phenomenon, this phenomenon of Latino support for Trump. Does anyone want to share in the chat what a sociological theory or account of this outcome might look like? We've got some excellent responses already. Kevin says it's the white Latinos. I'm only chuckling because I've heard this too, and I know that when you get to some of the differences among Latinos, there are class and social differences that become relevant, even within this group. And so it's the white Latino, says Kevin. Christopher says, not Mexican Latino, that's the other ones on the East. And so maybe Christopher, if you can elaborate a little bit. Hope says, didn't a lot of Cuban Americans vote for Trump because of anti-communist propaganda Trump put out? I could be wrong. Excuse me. Hope, you're right on point. Cuban Americans have traditionally identified with the Republican Party, and because the reason is because Cubans in America are disproportionately ones who fled the communist regime in Cuba, and so they understandably have an antipathy for anything that they even suspect might be related or connected to that. And so while unrealistic, they tend to despise the Democratic Party, or at a bare minimum, they at least vote with the Republican Party. I shouldn't speak for any Cubans, but I just think that they generally vote and associate and side with the Republican Party because of that experience. And so there are Cuban Americans who are decidedly Republican. And of course, Trump and the Republican Party plays on that and plays on that set of sympathies so that they can maintain that support. Ashley says, I know certain family members who voted for Trump because of reproductive rights. So there are questions about issue voting, and issue voting is sort of actually a separate perspective. However, what I'll grant you is that issue voting, and in particular voting on the basis of abortion rights or the lack thereof, is often an important consideration for Catholic voters. And many Latinos are Catholic, and those who are very Catholic are probably more inclined to identify with the Republican Party than ones who are not. And so in that respect, that's another way that you can imagine very easily a sociological reason or basis for Latino support for Trump or for the Republican Party. And so Christopher says, Florida Latinos and Cubans. Kevin says, I think for most Latinos, they tend to lean Republicans for religious purposes. I know the church I used to attend, before they went toxic, they used to preach against liberals and their agenda because it went against religious perspectives. So again, there's that consideration, the issue of religion and religious identity. Jacqueline says, I personally heard some Latinos say they voted for Trump because he was against abortion. Yeah, so that issue becomes important, and that issue is often connected to Catholic religious faith, which is often associated or related to being Latino, because many Latinos are Catholic, but not all, and not necessarily most, but many are. Kevin says, and it is the Cubans. And so this is obviously an interesting question, right? Because as I showed you before, there is a larger proportion of Blacks who identify with the Democratic Party than Latinos who identify with the Democratic Party. There's relatively speaking, a larger proportion, although still a minority of Latinos who identify with the Republican Party. But there are reasons that we can imagine why this might be the case. There could be reasons of religious faith and religious association. There could be reasons of upbringing and ideas connected to maybe agricultural or agrarian life that sometimes is idealized and very much a part of culture in places in Latin America. And so there's a lot of reasons why Latinos might support Trump and why they might identify with the Republican Party. And I think at this stage, what's important for us is to try to critique sociological voting from the perspective of economic voting. So far, we've presented sociological voting as fundamentally about partisanship and party ID and the way that party ID will determine vote choice, as well as evaluations of the candidates, considerations of the issues and positions, and so on and so forth. Basically, everything is attributable to partisanship and party ID. But economic voting tells us that great importance is given to economic considerations and how the economy under the incumbent government or in the future affected or will affect the individual or the society. And so this is a conflict. This is clearly a conflict. What I want to know is, can we critique sociological voting in partisanship based models from the perspective of economic voting? And what would that look like? What kind of a critique would that be? And how can we use the tools of economic voting or the ideas of economic voting to critique the ideas of sociological voting? Let's just kind of sit back on this for a moment, and I'll give you a chance to comment as the ideas come to you. But this is an important moment for us because this is when we begin to synthesize some of these different perspectives. As Gustavo points out, Latinos are not a monolithic group. They're very diverse. And so different experiences and upbringing influence how they vote. Absolutely. And I think that's what our discussion so far has gotten at. And so for example, the difference between, Cuban Americans and and Cubans, for instance.
I guess one way to think about it is if partisanship was ahead of economic voting, then a particular party, if they had more people who supported them from a historical point of view, would guarantee to dominate in elections over a period of time without worrying about what the conditions of the present day are.
So it could be that maybe sociological voting and historical influences just matter more than economic considerations. But let me ask you it this way, and in addition to that point, which is valid and is possible, frankly, and moreover, it could be that our sociological attachments influence the way we perceive the economic conditions. But let me ask you it this way. Is it possible that we're evaluating the parties themselves on economic grounds instead of on the basis of partisanship or pre-existing allegiances or identification? Is there a role, in other words, for both economic voting and sociological voting, but maybe ultimately for economic voting in how we differentiate or arbitrate between different parties? In other words, what kinds of evaluations would we be engaged in that would nullify our partisanship? Hope says, could you make the argument that a lot of sociological voting and economic voting is contrived and artificial? Well, certainly, if we discover that people and their partisanship is really the most important element, and therefore they're not engaging in real calculations of costs and benefits, maybe economic voting doesn't really exist. But I think that partisanship is probably real, right? I think people do feel a sense of attachment to a party, and that doesn't necessarily need to be a rational attachment, right? It can be sort of like and I think by definition, it's kind of an emotional attachment. It's like a sense of a sense of attraction, a desire to be closer, to nearer, to be associated with, for whatever reason, and be it rational or irrational. And so sociological voting can be irrational in a way that economic voting cannot. Economic voting needs to be rational. So I think, Hope, to answer your question, it could be that we're not rational enough and we're not well enough informed to engage in real economic voting. It's also possible, I think, that we're actually evaluating parties based on their economic performance. And so maybe there's both of it.
One thing I think is interesting to note is the way that as has been talking about in the chat, the way different partisans get their media and learn about the economy and base their economic voting off that. People who vote for a particular party are more likely to consume specific media outlets that don't have a explanation of what the other side is saying or doing. So uh, they could get a perception of the economy through this partisan lens, where the numbers aren't exactly black and white. They're these shades of gray painted by the media in which interprets these numbers.
And that reminds me of Hope's question. Hope said, "Is it possible that this type of voting is actually just sort of artificial?" And in from Ishan's perspective, from what he just said, absolutely. If we're just kind of having our viewpoints reinforced by these funnels of information that are just kind of constructed as echo chambers, I think that your initial partisanship ceases to be important because perhaps then it's just being kind of reinforced by this echo chamber, and then in that regard, maybe partisanship and those initial attachments cease to be meaningful in the way that they originally were. And I think that that's fair and in a fair assessment of the media environment. This is a question that comes up again and again, the nature of the media environment and how television or information and the quality of the information in particular affect the ability of voters to make informed decisions and to evaluate candidates. And to answer my question and to engage this a little bit more deeply, if we want to critique the theory of sociological voting from the perspective of economic voting, well, we need to return to that original logic of economic voting, which sees the voter as capable of engaging in these analyses and evaluations of costs and benefits, and capable of using information to evaluate alternatives and make the most informed and best choice for them. From this perspective, we can say that, well, partisanship can actually change. Remember that sociological voting says that it's very inertial. Partisanship can change due to policy positions, candidate evaluations, and party performance. And so if, as voters, we're continuously evaluating and analyzing positions, candidates, and parties, our partisanship very well may change, in which case our partisanship doesn't matter as much as our capacity to engage in economic evaluations of political candidates and parties. Where you fall and where you stand on this issue is actually really, really important, because this is a fundamental disagreement and controversy in literature on comparative political behavior. Now, the Michigan scholars, they reject that. They reject the idea that issues and economic evaluations affect partisanship. The reason that they reject it is because they believe that voters on the whole typically have low levels of political knowledge. Even when they're relatively informed, they're still relatively uninformed compared to what they would need to know to be fully informed and to be fully rational and capable of making economic evaluations of the kind attributed to them by the economic model. And they also say that there's a lack of ideological sophistication which prevents voters from making judgments based on issues. And so what the Michigan scholars think above all is that it's incompatible, a vision of voters as rational and calculating, and a vision of voters as adhering to sociological norms and following pre-prepared scripts. So this is a fundamental conflict between the two approaches. Whether voters are fully informed and calculating and changing their partisanship based upon evaluations of parties and candidates, and voters being all about a logic of appropriateness in following sociological cues in voting in line with the party that is of their partisanship and party ID adopted in childhood. These are incompatible and irreconcilable. And I think that it's something that is a question that I would pose to you, frankly, and I would wonder if you ultimately think economic or sociological voting prevails. It might be that in reality, there's some line in the sand, is some middle ground or somewhere in the middle where in practice people actually fall. And I think that it's possible that both the Michigan scholars underestimate voters and that the economic voting scholars overestimate voters. I think that it's possible that we're both not perfectly informed, but also better informed than maybe the Michigan scholars think we are. It's not, it's not obvious to me that we're just adopting the partisanship of our parents and just voting in line with them. I personally changed my party ID, and to the extent that I have one, I changed it and kept it changed from where I initially felt like I was in relation to my parents. And maybe many of you have had a similar experience in life. But the point that I want to make to you is that this is a debate and a disagreement. And this invokes and sort of taps into some of the key controversies in comparative political behavior about how much information voters have, how ideologically sophisticated they are, how capable they are of using information to evaluate candidates, how willing they are to change their partisanship in light of new information, the influence of their formative years, and so on and so forth. These are some of the fundamental questions in the literature. So there's a lot of interesting comments in here. So Moto G6 says that I've noticed that people I grew up with changed their affiliation when they started dating someone whose family had different views from their own. That's very interesting. That's also a logic of social appropriateness, but a different one than one anticipated by the sociological model that we're discussing here. Christopher says economic goals equal fund education for trade jobs and government service jobs that run America. Hope says, I think that it's hard to chalk it up to just one thing. Media now more than ever is affecting politics in ways no one thought possible. So there's sort of a role for the media environment in maybe shifting and affecting partisanship or affecting voting behavior. Gustavo says, how can you critically think if you know only one perspective? Touche, but that's why we're trying to learn as many of them as possible in a class like this. Okay. So one of the key questions and one of the key issues tapped into by this controversy between economic voting and sociological voting about whether partisanship changes and whether voters are engaged in evaluations of candidates and parties and whether they change their partisanship on the basis of those is the question of whether partisanship is generally stable or if it tends to change. And this, of course, is an empirical question, right? How stable or unstable partisanship is something that we have information about. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that momentarily. But before I do, I actually want to put it to you, and I want to see what your sense of this is. So I'm going to launch a poll, and we'll take a moment to respond to this, but just let me know what you think is generally speaking, sort of the norm or sort of the pattern. Hope shares that in my political psychology class, we talked about how party loyalty and symbolic politics can completely change someone's opinion on a candidate or an issue, and it is very hard to refute. Absolutely. And this question of partisanship and party loyalty is one we're taking on here as well. And this is sort of the question here, does partisanship become quite sticky? Does it endure? Is it hard to change this partisan loyalty? Or is it more fluid? And does it respond to evaluations of candidates and parties that might change from election to election in response to economic circumstances? Hope to answer your question. That has more to do, I think, with sociological voting, because sociological voting is all about how you sort of develop these formative views or these formative attachments, and then they kind of just persist because of how you were formed that way and how it becomes a part of the logic of appropriateness in your social circles, and how it just sort of reproduces itself because of your cognitive biases and stuff like that. So it's definitely sociological voting. And the voting on the the poll here is quite interesting as well. I'm actually surprised. I'm actually not as surprised as I thought I would be, but it's still very close. I can't yet call this. We still have 4 voters who've yet to respond, and those 4 votes could change the results if they go a certain way. And so if you've yet to vote, please do so. Oh wow, it's very close. I think at that, where I'm going to have to call it. The AP has called this race. I'm ending the poll and sharing the results. As you can see, it's very close. The bulk of you, 29 of you, or 53%, said that partisanship is generally stable. And 26 of you, or 47% of you, said that it tends to change. And so what that suggests to me is that, although I didn't ask you this, it suggests to me that a lot of you may be sympathetic to the sociological view of voter behavior or of vote choice. And it's possible that a large number of you, or a majority of you, may see voter ID as relatively enduring and relatively stable, and perhaps voter behavior as relatively stable as well. Now, these are questions that we'll take on in more detail as we go forward. They'll come up again and again, but this was an introduction to them today, and I'm happy that you were here with us to be a part of it. I'm going to let you go now. I'm going to stop with the recording, and I'll see you on Friday.